Hello, good morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever it is, whenever it is you are. I am Christy, and it is Weekend Winters. So I'm still adjusting my setup here when it comes to my lighting and whatnot. So apologies if I'm looking a little front lit. Doesn't really matter. Anyway, guys, I have a lot of fun things to go through. Get to nerd out, always love that. And so, yeah, let's go ahead and start with today's show. So first, I should say that during this, I am going to do I want to do unbroken sort of explanations. And so if you can save your questions to the end, then I'll deal with them like when I remember. How about that? Is that fair? All right. So before I start, though, I want to say hello to Sibwolf, Allison, City Life, John Doe, and Sean House. Good morning, everyone. Well, good afternoon, my time. Like I said, wherever it is, whenever it is you are. All right, so now that we're sort of finally moving beyond Donald Trump, I wanted to get back to some topics that weren't just focused on anti-fascism. Because part of the problem, I think, with the issues of the rise of Trump have to do with a lack of understanding of how things are done in the real world and how, just a lack of education. I'm just gonna be honest about it, a lack of education. And also very, very biased and unfounded views that some people have about knowledge in the world. And that's what I wanted to deal with today. So we're gonna look eventually at a video by King Crocoduck. It's an older video now, but it still is wrong as it was 2 years ago. And then I'll deal with them when I remember. Yeah, pretty much, Kenneth. I mean, I can see your comments. You can't see me yet, but I can see your comments. I'll show you in a second. And we're going to explain why science is a social construct. But to do that, because King Crocoduck just gets so wrong from the start, we need to start at the beginning and explain exactly what social constructionism is and how things are socially constructed, what sorts of things are socially constructed, and also I'll break down a lot of misunderstandings and also straw man arguments that are made about social constructionism and social constructs. So let me go ahead and today's lighting is a little bit odd. It's not very sunny out, so no, that's okay. That works. That lighting works, I think. I'm a little bit overly lit on this side. Maybe I can counter that a bit by bouncing some light off of there. We'll see. That's a little bit harsh. So anyway, let me go ahead and show you the screen that I am using. Oop, I'm gonna pop myself over on the other side of the screen now. All right. So actually, no, I think I went through this before. I'm gonna put myself over here and put this over here and put you guys on the other side of the screen. I'm doing this whole swapsy thing. So I used to, when I was I was a British Academy postdoctoral fellow, and as part of my duties at the University of Birkbeck, I taught both at the law school and I taught at the sociology and politics department at Birkbeck. Methods of political analysis. Okay, now let me swap this over so that it looks proper. There we go. That's a little bit better. No, I don't know if that really helps. Anyway, so one of the things I'm going to do is go through my notes. Because if you understand the philosophy of science, and this applies not just to social science, this applies to all science, because science is a process of knowledge production. That's primarily, its function is to produce knowledge. And how does it produce that knowledge? Well, it produces it amongst people. It produces it socially. So let's just talk about why and how that is. And I hope that after this, people will understand the concept of social constructionism a little bit better. Already having the debates in the chat about science as a social construct. All right. So the King Crocoduck video, I should say, we are going to look at it, but the problem with it, let me just tell you just characteristically, like what my problems with it were to start and why I'm going to start here, is that first, it doesn't answer the question like the premise of the video is science a social construct? And then he spends the first 8 minutes just throwing out scientific terms that have to do with the practice of science, the methodology of science, and then gives this sort of really says, if you're saying that science happens in a society and that means it's socially constructed, that's just a truism. I think that's the closest he gets to the definition, which is just so wrong. So let's just start from the beginning. Now, my notes on both quantitative and qualitative political analysis are available from academia.eu, and so you can go and check those out at any time. Now, of course, I didn't make all these things up. I actually looked at books, looking at methods of doing research, and in particular, Bryman, who is like a standard textbooks, covers a lot of stuff. Burr does social constructionism, which is, that's I think a second edition, but she's got a third edition out now. And then that very, very good book called Ways of Knowing, Competing Methodologies in Social and Political Research. So again, there isn't a separate kind of science you do for the social sciences and the natural sciences. And this is a massive problem that King Crocoduck does not address in his video, which is he comes from a very narrow, almost discipline-specific examination of the process of science. And that gives a very distorted view of how science is done in other fields. So when we come to explaining, in this case, explaining any kinds of phenomenon, now, of course, we were talking about social research, but this could apply to any kind of phenomenon we find in the world. We are asking ourselves, well, first of all, like, what is happening? What is going on? We can also ask, why is it happening? Now, the what is happening is a descriptive analysis. We want to be able to describe these things are happening. The next is, like, why do these things happen? And that's a causal analysis. We're looking for causal relationships between outcomes and their antecedents. There's also things in the social sciences that we can ask that we don't ask in the natural sciences because they don't make sense, but that doesn't mean that they're not valid questions. Because when we're dealing with the social world, we're dealing with human beings and quality of life, issues of happiness, health, well-being. And that is, how can we make better things happen, which is one kind of value-based question, or how can we make things happen in a better way? More, maybe it's like you're looking at output at a work, right? And you're looking at how can you be more efficient. Now that's a value. It's not an objective, neutral thing. You want to achieve a certain goal for a reason, right? Now, like I say here, the ways that we can investigate these things can be answered using either quantitative or qualitative when it comes to social research. And that the difference is the way we think about the questions. What we think, for instance, exists will lead on to how we think we can know what exists, which will lead on to the approaches we take to the tool sets that we will draw upon to test our analysis, or to test things and investigate the world, and then particular methods. Let me go ahead and give a little explanation here. Actually, I'm going to go down to the building blocks of research, because at the end of the day, this is a question for all science. It's not just a question for the natural sciences or the social sciences. All science is a process of knowledge production. That's what science is. It is a method for producing knowledge. And if you look at it within that system or within that definition, it automatically becomes a social construct. Now let's just go define science, right? Let's just look at the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world, including the social world, through observation and experiment. Now, this sort of doesn't mention the role of the scientific community and the norms, but it does talk about it being an activity done by human beings with other human beings. Let's see what else. Branch of knowledge or study dealing with bodies of facts or truth systematically arranged and showing the operation of law. Any system of knowledge, this is a good one. Any system of knowledge that is concerned with the physical world and its phenomenon. It says unbiased observations and systematic experiences. So a process can try to be unbiased even if the people who are conducting the research are biased. The main thing here is that science is not done as a singular activity. The scientific, what is a fact and what is not a fact, and the criteria for establishing facts are created by human beings. And this is part of the process of creating knowledge. It's not a flaw. It's almost central to it, because human beings we're sort of like knowledge producers. We experience things and we try to interpret the world and understand it. The point of science is to discipline that process of knowledge production and create standards that we all agree to, making it a social construct. And then we can produce facts that actually aren't truths outside of us, because facts change over time. All right, so what are the building blocks upon which science operates? First question is, what exists, and how does it exist? Now, in a very sort of superficial way, we can talk about the existence of material reality, right? Material reality exists. Now, here's a harder question. Does democracy exist? Now, democracy doesn't exist in the same way that my physical objects exist. And yet, the United States practices democracy. A lot of countries practice democracy. So we can't say that democracy doesn't exist, because hopefully you live in a democracy. On the other hand, we can't point to a thing and say, that over there is democracy. You can't point to the Constitution, for instance, and say, this document is democracy. The document describes the process through which you achieve your democracy. So what does it mean to say democracy exists? And I don't want to give like a simplistic answer, because this is like the point of the question is to show that things can exist, especially in the social world, that influence people's lives, outcomes of, their education, their health, a lot of things that will determine how they experience their entire lives. But it's not something you can point to like a table. Social reality is probably something, I'm going to go out on a limb and say, we interact with social reality even more than we interact with our physical reality every single day. Social realities include, what side of the road do cars drive on? Money is a social construct, right? The exchange of goods. Language. The fact that I am making a noise with my mouth, and you hear that noise and you translate it into a word that you recognize because we've both been taught that word and we have a shared understanding of what it is. And then you use that meaning to interpret the sounds in order to understand what I'm saying. These are all social constructs. They're not threatening. And they're not imaginary. There's a difference. A unicorn is imaginary. It is a social construct. It is something that you take the idea of a horn and the idea of a horse and you put them together and you have a concept for a creature that doesn't exist. But it's not the fact that the unicorn doesn't exist doesn't make it the social construct. The social construct comes from the fact that you and I share this language of horn and unicorn where we put them together. It is that process of constructing communications across our brains that ends up allowing us to share understandings and be able to speak with each other. And so a unicorn is imaginary. Democracy is not imaginary. Democracy is a social fact or a social reality, but how we understand how it exists and where it exists and what quality of it exists is not going to be investigated with microscopes or telescopes or an MRI or anything like that. You have to talk to human beings because human beings construct their social realities. So what exists? If you deny that there is a social, I don't think that there's anybody out there. I'm not going to straw man. Unlike King Crocoduck, I'm not going to straw man the other side. I think that, for instance, Neil deGrasse Tyson understands democracy in some sense exists. He just doesn't, like in the tweet anyway, understand what a social fact is, or how facts are socially constructed. So the first question is what exists? And science is out there to produce reliable knowledge about what exists. And what you think exists will determine what you investigate. And therefore, if you don't think that there is any social reality, well, this is going to influence your research agenda. But we'll get onto bias in a second. After you, well, not in conjunction with knowing or thinking that you know or wanting to explore how things exist, what exists, the next step is how do we know about it? And this is where science comes in. And the fundamental problem that King Crocoduck makes in his video is that he skips epistemology and he goes right to methodology. And I'll explain methodology in a second. Epistemology is the process by which we can know about the thing we think exists. It's different from thinking it exists or not. So going back philosophically to ontology, we can talk about foundationalism, the idea that there are sort of like fixed existing processes in the world. And in the social sciences, one of those fixed existing processes that has an influence on people's lives that we measure and put into models is aging. We know that getting older produces in not each individual, but generally in individuals, very similar effects. Here's a really obvious one. The older you get, I mean, especially if you're a man, but women too, the older you get, the more concerned you are about the quality of healthcare you receive. And that's a very natural thing. But it is, you can make a cause and effect relationship between getting older and your concerns about your healthcare or the NHS or the quality of your Medicare, whatever else. And so we can use those to predict or at least control for different attitudes about the NHS that are separate from theory. So epistemology is a way that we go about investigating, right? So there's that thing like aging exists, for instance, being born or growing up in a sort of gendered normative way within a society will have influences, yada, 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 right? Then there are also, well, those physical, let's separate that out. The physical thing like aging is universal and is experienced by everyone pretty much unchangedly. The thing like having a gendered experience as you're raised as a child doesn't come from a biological process like aging does. It comes from the values that society puts on, you know, let's call it, you know, traditional or like old school patriarchal, hierarchical, you know, masculinity and femininity. Those social things can change, and those are attitudes and behaviors. Now, they have an influence, but they're not fixed like aging, for instance. Okay, so ontology is what exists, and the social world does exist. The social research agenda does acknowledge that there are some sort of like physiological grounded things that can produce kinds of changes. But then most of it has to do with the society, the education you get, how much money you get. All these things will affect your attitudes. So again, does money exist? This is a question of ontology, and I would say yes, it exists as a social construct. Epistemology goes down to how we can know about it, and science being a process. And then once you, let's say, I want to do a scientific investigation of something, then the next question is methodology. How do we acquire valid knowledge? And this is where we get into things like induction, deduction, abduction, you know, going back and forth between induction, standards of falsification, can look at observation, all these sorts of things. Is like, how do we go? Methodology is the approach, or the people talk about it like the toolbox that you want to use. Now, as a social scientist who studies political attitudes and values and beliefs and looks at people's behaviors, I look at survey data, I look at questionnaire data, and that is the framework within which I'm going to try to understand people's attitudes and behaviors. The methodology would be like doing an analysis of survey data. Methods, the procedures, that would be the specific approaches that you use with the data. It could be ordinary least squares regression, logistic regression, time series analysis, event analysis, all kinds of stuff, latent class analysis, just going through all the courses that I've taken over time. And those individual procedures should fit the data set. Time series analysis data needs to look different from survey data. Survey data needs to meet some arbitrary criteria that scientists have used to decide this is what we need to have valid data based on theories of generalization and whatnot. So, yeah, I think here I just kind of go through more like ontology and a question of, you know, what exists, and yes, all right. So this is good. This is why I like Burr. Thinking about definitions of reality. This is important too, because maybe people think their understanding of reality is the same when they say the word. However, because it's been in use so long and a lot of people have drawn on it, I think Burr, in a very handy way, allows us to think about the term reality in 3 different scenarios and really unpack what are we trying to get at here. Do we mean reality that is what is true versus what is false in that dichotomy? Reality in terms of being a description of true things and not making mistakes? Do we mean things that reality is material reality? And this is like versus illusion, as she has. So what exists versus what doesn't exist? Or are we talking about some sort of essence of things versus a construction? Reality is like, and I would argue that things don't have an essence because everything is a composite. There's not an essence of democracy that we can go out and find. So when we talk about a social construct, let me just go down here to see if there's anything else. Here I'll go. For our purposes, like when I was teaching it, ontological claims, what is, are claims and assumptions that are made about the nature of social reality, claims about what exists, what it looks like, what units make it up, and how these units interact with each other. Talk a little bit about constructionism, objectivism, and I go through like the 2 ways of looking at it, foundationalists and anti-foundationalists, and you really try to get at the idea that social constructs are a fundamental part of our reality. Our societies cannot function without social constructs. Let me explain why that is. I found define social construct. It's really kind of a basic idea here. Social as in between people, construction as in built. What are the agreements that we have come to? Now, some of that, this isn't like we always choose our social constructs. Most of us don't ever get to choose our social constructs. We're born into a world that has already organized a lot of this stuff for us. And the influence we can have is, it depends on the area, but we can change things, but it takes time, right? So here's a definition of a social construct is an idea that has been created and accepted by the people in a society. Money is an idea that's been accepted globally, all right? Money is a social construct. It's represented by paper. It's represented by coins, but the coin isn't like if I just if I got out a piece of paper and I drew 50 euros and I colored it myself in the right way and I put on, I put on a nice little picture, I can't use that as money. I can't pass counterfeit dollars. Why? Because we have assigned certain kinds of paper and certain kinds of coin validity and other kinds not. Now, that is an entirely arbitrary decision. That doesn't make it sort of invalid, but it does show that money isn't an inherent thing. The paper doesn't have inherent, monetary value. It is us using the money to represent something, this idea. All language is a social construct because it has been invented by people and is shared among people. English doesn't exist outside of human beings. And yet everything we do is mediated through this social construct. So that isn't to say that because I say the word table doesn't have a material reality. However, what things I can validly call a table are restricted, right? It's not, the table doesn't have an essence of table. I can make a table out of literally anything. I can make a table out of 4 glasses and a book. And if the books, like if I take my D&D book here, my Dragon Heist book, and I had 4 glasses, and I added 4 glasses under here and set it on top, and it rested, I could make this book into a table. It wouldn't stop being a book, but it would be a book. There isn't an inherent bookness, and there isn't an inherent tableness. These are just labels that we use to communicate things. So, the idea that, science being a social construct, of course it is, because who came up with the process of science? Human beings. And who agreed to the standards of the scientific process? Human beings. That doesn't mean that it makes science invalid. It only makes it a social construct. And to deny that it's anything other than a social construct, to me, it seems a bit bizarre. Now, one of the things that people, especially, I want to say, I'll attribute it, King Crocoduck, because he is working in the natural sciences and is dealing with things that are material in nature and have repeatedly consistent observations, that somehow his approach is getting him closer to a truth, closer to something that is beyond. Sorry, John Doe. Okay, I'm going to say, I'm confusing the F out of you. John Doe, what is your question? What can I explain? And I will interrupt it for this because I understand these things and they are hard. And I spent years, I still listen to like John Searle and philosophy and language talks and get a bit confused. So I see this and I'm worried. John Doe, write to me. What is confusing to you? Because again, when you understand something, it's hard to not know, like be confused about it. So please take the time to write that up. Where was? Oh yes. All right. The process of science is a process of knowledge production. We use science and its methods, like observation, theory, which there's a definition King Crocoduck gets wrong. From theory, we develop hypotheses. From hypotheses, we find appropriate data. We find the appropriate method to analyze that data, and then we draw conclusions. And from those conclusions, based on peer review and a collective agreement of experts in the community according to socially constructed standards of validity, we generate facts. Now, are facts truths? That's not to say are facts true. Right? A fact can be accurate and for the time it was developed, but not be true. Let me give you an example. What was it, like when was Pluto discovered? I want to say 1953, and I don't think that's right. I think discovery of Pluto. Let me show you how we construct facts. Of Pluto. Yeah. 1930. I was only off by 2.5 decades. All right. In 1929, people lived in a world where there were 8 planets. And that was a fact. They thought that that was a true representation of the world. And to the best of their knowledge, at the time, it was true. Was it truth? Was it, just like some sort of quality of absolutely perfect, like representation of the world? Well, no, because again, our experience is mediated through our language and our knowledge base and what we know. So when Tombe apparently took a picture of Pluto and went, oh, I explained it. Okay, thanks, John Doe. Good, I'm glad. When he looked through the telescope and went, oh, wait, there's a new planet out here. And then all of his, I'm sure at the time, because racism and sexism, white dude colleagues came along and went, oh yeah, that's a planet. We've discovered a new planet. A fact about our world has changed. And now we will no longer say that there are 8 planets in the solar system. There are 9. The facts changed. Nothing about the universe changed. Nothing about the solar system changed. The only thing that changed was our perception of it. And that became knowledge. 9 planets became a fact. I grew up being taught that there were 9 planets in the solar system. Okay, question is, you say, like, was it wrong? Well, that depends. Let me drink my coffee. After several decades and more exploration with better technology, people changed their mind. Scientists, now this is like an elite cadre, just like certain people in the world have the credentials here to make these kinds of decisions. Not every, someone could go in February 19th of 1930 and say, no, Pluto's not a planet, but their opinion wouldn't matter because they're not considered knowledge producers in our society, which is also, that attribution is a social construct. We're giving certain people authority to make decisions as to what facts are. I'm not saying that that's inherently wrong, but you have to acknowledge how much this is mediated. My point is that humans make this stuff up, and we agree to it. So, Exactly, DNF, or DN fan. After more exploration and gathering more data, a more refined categorization of planets was developed by these experts, and they went back and went, actually, no. Pluto's not a planet, it's a dwarf planet. Slightly different, but it's not quite the same. So now there are, again, 8 planets in the solar system, and this is a fact. Well, if science produces eternal truths, there's no way we could change our facts. Facts are our best knowledge at the time, but facts aren't truths. They might be true depending upon what we know, but there is a gap between what we think we know and we're being accurate as to what we think we know, and having access to some mystical, objective truth that is beyond question. And I think what really the insecurity of the natural scientists come down to is I think they feel very grounded in this idea of certainty, and that they aren't getting at conditionally true things that are true based on our knowledge, but truth things, like that they are tapping into something that is beyond question, that is beyond human production, that is somehow objectively true. And this sort of it feels to me like they take an unwarranted amount of authority taken from a misperception of the strength of the truths that they are tapping into. When the fact is that science is a process of knowledge production, so it is constantly changing. And it is open to alterations or adaptations or new thinking by human beings. In which case, it can't be truth, because truth isn't changeable. Truth is, the way that I think about this truth as being like an eternal sort of like beyond whatever we perceive of it kind of thing. Whereas a true fact is one is a best representation, or it's an accurate representation of our knowledge at the time. So I can use social constructionism to prove that everything is a llama, except ironically llamas. I would like to see you do that. So a social construct is merely anything that we in a society have agreed to make our lives easier to process. And science is definitely a social construct, because it was developed by people. It is sort of like, it operates according to conventions and standards and agreements that people have come to. Now, let me give you an example of this. In the social sciences, when I do statistical analysis, and I want to get something peer-reviewed, I adopt the same convention as my peers, because that's what I've been taught, and that's what it takes to get my paper published. That those variables that are statistically significant to a p equals 0.5 or less significance value, which means in 100 samples, I'd only have a 5 in 100 chance of pulling out a sample that would be different from my model results. That's fine for the social sciences. We will tolerate that much error, p equals less than 0.05. If I went into the medical field, where people's lives are on the line, and I was doing a trial and some kind of test, the standards are 1 p equals less than 1.001. That means that you'd have to draw a sample 1,000 times before you'd find a different result. And that's because you can't tolerate as much error in a medical study as you can in a social science study. When I study the effects or the explanatory power of psychological predispositions toward sort of more agentic or communal, don't worry about it, approaches to looking at the world, no one's going to get sick. It's fine. Like, we just need to be, pretty rigorous. 5 out of 100 is, 95% of the time you're going to get the same result. But we don't want to throw out sort of the baby with the bathwater by holding us to this ridiculously high standard where we can never say anything about the world. That's a choice. That's entirely an arbitrary. It's entirely arbitrary. the social convention could be p equals less than 0.04 or 0.5 or sorry, or 0.07 or 10. But we choose 5 because, you know, it's like an odd number, 5, 10, 15, 20. Like there's no magic thing about p equals less than 0.05. It's just that's the amount of error that the community before us agreed upon and we inherited. But the medical field is completely different. So even the standards by which knowledge is produced changes. But what doesn't change is the process of science. Science doesn't change if you've got a social object like democracy, or why people voted the way they did in an election, or their attitudes towards homosexuality and heterosexuality, versus like how you do an analysis of, you know, within you know, like a scientific approach to, I don't know, something in the material sciences. Right? The process is the same. And it's the process of science that is a social construct here. Okay. Now, let me just go through this a little bit. Yeah, is that a trans gamer girl? I feel some Douglas Adams in the chat there. Time and his illusion, Tuesdays doubly so. So your ontology, what you think exists, will influence the kind of questions you ask. What approach to epistemology you adopt in trying to answer those questions, and the methods you use, and how you interpret your results. All right. Now, I'll give an example. Human sexuality. It might be considered common sense to think of behaviors as a result of the drive to reproduce, and that men and women's sexual behaviors lead to different roles in the evolutionary process. Evolutionary theories underpin what is natural, but just because you can describe something in nature, saying, all right, if we want to look at reproduction, we want to ignore people who are infertile or people who don't choose to have children, we can look at these biological processes. But then a society will come in and say, oh, well, because people in nature, there's reproduction, that is normal in a normative way. Like it's not just about what people do, it's about what people ought to do, and they conflate those. So if you know, like you can look at something from a physiological point of view, but if you want to understand human morals and social norms, then you're not going to be looking only at biology, you're going to be looking at attitudes. All right, let me just go see. Yeah, you can study things like patriarchy by investigating how it operates in different countries and different stuff. So, and then I go through a whole history of like how people have produced knowledge over the centuries. And again, you can look on both of the books of Ways of Knowing or the Bryman's social research methods to understand those. All right. I think I've explained now why science is a social construct. And it really comes down to science is a method humans use to produce facts, reliable facts in the world, and those facts are open to change. And it's human beings who agree all those things. That's what a social construct is. That's all we really have to say. I do think it's worth maybe saying a little bit here because King Crocoduck gets some really basic stuff wrong. And I'm trying to think now if I should Control-Alt-T, go back and open up. Hold on, let me go in my history. I think I've got in my PPTs, the difference between like theory, hypothesis. I know I have some stuff on the scientific method. So I think it's worth looking at it because I disagree entirely with the idea of the definitions given as to what. Oh no, it's the next one. My next set of lectures. Yeah, here we go. So before I talk about like cross tabulations and correlations, let's talk about the scientific method. Because King Crocoduck has some weird takes. Starts with facts and works backwards and all kinds of stuff. All right. I think this is the best definition of theory, the most broadly encompassing definition of a theory, or the second one, not the first. In the sciences, including the social sciences, a theory is this is important, it's a logical explanation of the manner of interaction of a set of phenomena. Now, why is that important? The logical explanation here is really important because you're trying to describe a causal relationship. Generally, as we said, or as I said earlier, you can use science to describe what exists, how, descriptive. You can look at causal relationships between phenomenon, causality. You can try to characterize a causal relationship and what is producing these outcomes, or you can look at things normatively. How can we make better things happen, or how can we make things happen better? But it is important that a theory is a description of an outcome that includes a logical explanation, and it describes the sort of phenomenon that are at play. So, in addition, so the things that characterize a theory is that it has a test. It produces a testable model of the manner of interaction of that phenomenon, and that's what we call hypotheses. A hypothesis is a testable statement capable of being falsified that is derived entirely from the logic of the theory. Not only should a theory be able to explain current events, it should be able to predict future occurrences. And as I say, it's capable of being tested or otherwise falsified through empirical observation. And I spend quite a lot of time in my course discussing falsification and why it plays such an important role in theories. Also, how do we generate theories? Theories don't come out of the sky, they're not handed down, blah, 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 right? This, we can either get them through experience, the sort of empiricist approach, or we can get them from deducing things about the world based on logical reasoning. So, deductive theories, you start from a theory and you go to the world. Theory, you start with your theory, get your hypothesis, you do your data collection, you generate your findings, and then you figure out, is my hypothesis confirmed or rejected or partially rejected? And then you might revise the theory based on that knowledge. Inductive, you go from the world to the theory. You go, here's a whole bunch of relationships I see. I keep seeing this pattern of X and Y. And I think what connects them is this thing I can't see, which is the causal mechanism. So let me develop a theory based on this, and then I develop a hypothesis, and I collect the data, and so on and so forth. So human beings, deduction, induction, and that sort of abduction or retroduction or iterative approach are necessary for theory generation and hypothesis generation. Also to assess which findings are valid and which aren't. So I could talk about naive inductionism. I also talk about abduction, methodology. Where is my thing of the scientific method? I thought I had this little thing. Well, anyway, doesn't really matter. We got the idea that, here we go. In a quantitative research approach, you have a question about the world. You do some background reading, and this was where you get your theories from. Then based on theories, or if you have your own theory of a causal relationship, a logical series of interconnected statements describing a set of phenomenon, you can develop your own hypothesis. And then you find some data and you do an experiment, you analyze your results. And you're like, And then you was there a problem with my data? If my data had no problems, well, and my theory didn't turn out, or it wasn't what I thought it would be, or I got a different result, and you go back and forth. All of this is human knowledge production. So of course, science is a social construct. I just don't understand how you can say that it's not unless you don't understand what social constructionism or social constructs are. So, at this point, before we get to the King Crocoduck video, which is where we're going to go now, I want to take a moment and give you all a chance to ask questions. So, I will, let's see, should we leave this up? Yeah, because you can do qualitative research too. It just tends to be more inductive than deductive. And yeah, I'll leave you on that. So I want to take a break. I want to make some more coffee. And I want to give you guys a chance to type any comments up. Therefore, I'm going to dip out for about 2 minutes. I'll put y'all on some music here so that you can chill. Type up your questions or comments or thoughts, and we'll deal with these. Hey, Rory Cats, and then we will go on to look at King Crocoduck and all of the logical fallacies and poisoning the well, sort of like all the kinds of ways in which he avoids the core question of science is a social construct and facts are social constructs. Okay, so excellent. How long have we gone? Like half hour? Oh my gosh, even longer. So sorry, I didn't realize I was talking that much. Okay, so 2 to 4 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll do the video review, which, by the way, we're not going to watch the whole thing because the first, like, I don't know, 8 minutes is just waffle, and so we'll kind of skip all that. All right, very good. I'm going to put that music back on. Let the music play. We'll see y'all in a second. Oi, oi. Back. Cause more trouble. Hey guys, yep, so I got my coffee, did my leg stretch, and sorry, I always think I'm going to be more efficient in my discussions, and then I realize these concepts are they're not self-evident always, and so it helps to have examples, okay, so let me go see. Coffee time, woman, absolutely, Flint, thank you. Is Rory Katz a social construct? Absolutely. My own conception of Christie is a social construct. When you start to really think about anything mediated by language is using a social construct, and therefore it is mediated through a social construct, you start to really get away from any ability to claim that you have an understanding of the world that is sort of how would you even get how would you get outside of a social construct? Now, again, this has nothing to do with the fact that material reality exists. These things operate at the same time. It is because we have a material reality that we perceive with our brains interpret, I should say, right? And then we use language as our way of communicating these things to other people. We need social constructs. Society couldn't function without social constructs. So is that a snuggle? No, it's what it is okay. So let me go through the questions. I'll answer the silly one first. This isn't a snuggle. It is, though, the best winter sort of sweater I was able to find. And I wear it constantly, and I wash it constantly, and it is one of my favorite things to wear, and I think especially with my 20s hair, it looks really awesome. Okay, Shiu. Let's see what people had to say. Yeah, there's some good things already I can see in the chat. So let's have a little look. Rory Katz, definitely a social construct. Now there can be a material Rory Katz, or cat that has Rory Katz on it, but in terms of the name Rory Katz, all that, yeah, social construct. Also love it when Andrew says, also love it when right-wingers say the social sciences are not real sciences, or words to that effect. Most sociologists, for example, follow our current scientific method. How is that not science? Exactly. What makes something science is whether or not it is produced by the scientific method. And, I would say, this is a mischaracterization, but I would say that the average social scientist knows more about statistical methods of analysis than people in astronomy or in physics, because I think that there's only a few ways of analyzing data in the natural sciences, whereas in the social sciences, like I said, there's time series analysis, there's latent class analysis, also known as market segmentation, there's ordinary least squares regression, there's weighted ordinary least squares regression, there is logistic regression, what else? Panel data analysis with problems of endogeneity and also autocorrelation. There are so many statistical approaches in order to manage the problems of data in the social scientists. I would say that probably if you were to go and read, you have two scientists, one from the social sciences field and the other one from the natural sciences. The social scientist is actually going to know more stats, more statistical methods than the natural scientist. Okay, it's all quarks. Can I talk about field research using YouTube and other social media sometime? I can give you a little bit of my take on that, which is when it comes to doing analysis with social media data, which I know is very sexy right now, by the way. It's big data and social media data is these are the areas where the social sciences are moving, and the natural sciences too, but increasingly, the social sciences are handling and managing the problems of big data. In fact, I've published recently on the construction of unstructured data into a structured big data set with a colleague. It's going to be coming out in the Research Data Journal, which is a social science data journal. It describes various data sets that have been deposited so people have a better understanding of the theoretical structuring of it and the framing of it and all that kind of stuff, so that they understand in this case how we constructed our variables from unstructured ones. Anyway, the thing about social media data is that it's only representative of people who use social media. And so while, again, this is a question of what kind of claims do you want to make about the world? If you preface your statements by saying, this only applies to people who are on and use social media, then you can make all kinds of accurate statements about social media. But when it comes to making wider claims about, let's say, human behavior outside of people who's, I just think you have to kind of qualify and specify the limits of your conclusions and not kind of over-egg the pudding, as they say. So I think that there's a lot of interesting and useful information that can come out of social media data analysis. However, it is highly skewed to people who are better off. You know, people who are super, super poor don't have the same kinds of resources. And that skews the whole sample. So, I mean, that's one of the things I would look for. I scroll down. Lucky Wanderer. Right-wingers think there's only one scientific method, not realizing the method is different from theoretical physics. Yeah, that's why I think it's good to go above the actual practicalities of how science is practiced in a discipline and look at the epistemology. Like, how do we know part of the scientific method? Because that more generic set of principles get distilled down into specific methodologies and methods, depending on the discipline. But they all adhere to the same kind of structure of, this is how knowledge is produced, and this is what we agree upon, and this is what will be accepted if you go to get it published. I was constructed by humans, okay? And if you like this type of bluesy folks, okay, music recommendation, a snuggle, assuming you can trust your senses. Yeah, I think that and trusting your senses, one, it's about, measurement. It's also about acknowledging perhaps a potential bias in your own interpretations. And, when you say that science isn't a social construct, it's getting at some truth, and you're trying to take away any role of human value in the production of knowledge through the scientific method, then you're really ignoring the way that, for instance, scientific racism tries to harness that process in order to advance an agenda based not on science, but on pre-assumed normative values that basically whatever is white is good. And that's the starting point before you get to the scientific method. So the scientific method doesn't make scientific racism scientific. It's just a bias against non-white people that is carried through and colors and distorts the scientific method. And the scientific method can't correct for that. Why? Because it's not produced by anything other than human beings. So a bad assumption and a bad series of interpretations will not be caught out by science. It's people who have to do that. Okay. Looks so soft. It is so soft. Oh, mama. It is. This is why I love it. I think it was made by this crazy name I can't say. I know this is really Hiddemunker. You probably won't be able to see that, my tag on there. But it's some sort of like nightwear, evening wear place. Actually, my bottoms, and that I'm wearing right now. All my stuff comes from there. Whenever they have a sale. Okay. Without material reality, we couldn't have social constructs, and without social constructs, we could not figure out material reality. Precisely. I mean, if you think about, our brains, okay. I said I was going to get to King Crocoduck, but this is actually really super important, Kenneth. So thank you for bringing it up. Our brains identify objects. They're very good. Like kids, but babies, before they have concepts, will interact with material reality. Right? And so our brains are able to process objects. And our brains are super, super good at pattern detection. They're so good at pattern detection that we develop superstitions. We're so over primed to infer cause and effect that we think that, wearing a certain set of socks is going to affect, not everyone obviously, but the superstition of, if you do something or you don't do something, you can affect an outcome that's completely unrelated. So our brains are already preset for us to do this. But we would not be able to do science if we didn't have language. And what does language do? Language sets the boundaries around different objects, and it also clusters, it defines some concepts like values and emotions that we experience or can understand, but we don't have a material existence for. Love, democracy, freedom, equality, right? And the other thing language does is it delineates the boundaries of those things for us. And I've made this example, or I've given this example before, but, you know, it is an arbitrary decision to say that a tree is bark, branches, leaves, roots. It is also plausible. You could look at a tree as a chemical process. It's something that takes in water and evaporates it. It's something that takes in carbon dioxide and puts out oxygen. You can think about, if you framed trees as material chemical, like plants, like plant as in factory, that they're constantly producing oxygen. If you understood the world in that way, then cutting down a forest has a much different impact on how you think about what you're doing than if you just see trees as material things that you burn or you make tables out of. So, you know, these things aren't given. There isn't a right way and wrong way. There are values in everything we do because we're people. Winter sweater, yes. What else we have? I am a social construct, meow. You are. Is there any time when someone said X is a social construct and you thought they were incorrect? I think that's a really good question. I don't really think about... so the short answer is no. The way that I perceive the world is that there is a material reality that exists absence of mind, right? And that's not a controversial statement. Material reality existed before human beings, and it will continue to exist long after human beings. But what we tend to do as human beings is not acknowledge. This is basically a result of the Enlightenment. The assumption was made that somehow human beings are like cameras and we just take pictures of the world and there's nothing that we have no role of sort of like interpretation. That there's no, we're not a mediating factor. And also, you know, up until like Wittgenstein, there was this assumption that language was transparent, that a tree is a tree. A tree wasn't, you know, didn't have a value in terms of what its definition was. It was merely describing it. But as I said, if you think about trees as little organic chemical plants, that's another way of thinking about it. And that has a different set of values. And so when philosophers realized or started to reflect on what role do we play as human beings in terms of, like, Kant talks about this a little bit, the social construction, a lot of authors have discussed this over time. But what it comes down to is that because we are raised in a society and we have language as a filter, we need to think about how that filter affects our perceptions of the material reality. We experience reality through a linguistic sort of like gauze, you know, like there's something there that we can't see but affects our perception of it. And so I'm trying to think like what isn't a social construct. No. So the short answer is no. But what I would say again is that there's material reality, but human beings don't perceive material reality directly. We perceive it through a filter of language. And that language sometimes has values in it that we don't reflect upon, or we should reflect upon. Everything is filtered through language, which relies on social construct. Yes, thank you. Trans gamer girls were way ahead of me. Way ahead of me. All right. I love the fact that Christy Winter's example is so on point that the word plant is also used for a factory. Yes. I think you could draw a meaningful line between social constructs and emergent properties of society. I think that there is an interconnection there. Absolutely. That a society, and it's not just like, this is another thing too, that social constructionists would probably point to, is that who gets to decide what is knowledge in a society? Who gets to decide what is moral? And that is power. Now, I'm not saying that all scientists are corrupted with power. I am a scientist. I'm not corrupted with power. But it is the fact that there is a ton of gatekeeping in the scientific community, that there are standards. You know, as someone who both has had peer reviews and has been on the other side of peer review, I can tell you that, you know, there aren't, one of the things that King Crocoduck tries to allege is that social constructionists want a plurality of sciences or different types of sciences. No, that's just not true. it's regression is regression is regression is regression. The question is, which variables are you putting into your model, and what are they controlling for, and what is your theoretical basis? And does the thing you're measuring really measure what you think you're measuring, or are you measuring something else? And so, who gets to decide what knowledge is, and who makes up those people, and what kind of biases they have? This all goes into, it's something that should be considered. At least you can't not acknowledge it when you're talking about the social construction of knowledge. So I think social constructionism is really good at rooting out hidden biases we hold, for example. Using the example of a tree, we focus on the physical concepts rather than other modes of being. Yeah, or other modes of functioning. Absolutely. And it's not that we want to tear science down. It's just you need to stop worshiping it like it's truth, when facts are true given the understanding that we had at the time. It's just being a bit more humble. It's being a bit more self-reflective. It's taking ownership of the fact that human beings produce this, and we're not, astrophysicists don't go to the temple of science and receive the truth from the universe that make them, as knowledgeable as gods. No. And that's the kind of rarefication or attempt to sort of make, science into this, the same way that religion claims to hold truths. Science does produce facts, but that doesn't mean we always have the truths, the sort of like ontological truths, because we're only human. Right, what else we go? All of this is part of what the movie Arrival was exploring. Oh, cool. I'd also say a filter of human physiology. We cannot perceive every... Yeah, exactly. This is the other thing, too, is that we need to rely on instruments to understand the universe. We also, and that's the physical universe, but when it comes to even understanding human behavior, understanding that people don't always know the things that motivate them. They aren't always conscious. They might have unconscious drives, or they are conditioned in certain ways that they're not aware of. And so there are ways to explain human behaviors that they would not give themselves. Going back to the physiological impact of aging, right? As people get older, they're more likely to get sick, and so they're going to need to rely on health services more. And as a consequence, they have become more interested in funding of the health services, the quality of health service they get. Now, if you ask them, they're not going to necessarily say, my body is biologically aging, and therefore they're going to give some personal reasons, like, oh, I had knee surgery, or cancer runs in my family. So even how we go about understanding the world, has to be reflected upon. And the limitations, like we said, we can't see every single light frequency in the spectrum. We can't see beyond our universe without the aid of instruments. And those instruments, of course, will also mediate what we can and can't see. So there's a lot of limitations. It's not saying we can't do it. We just should be a bit more humble, I think. And social constructionism, I think, is a humbling thing that some scientists don't. They have they've overestimated the objectivity of the knowledge that they produce. I just heard some pagans debating creation of deities. Do gods exist before we name them? I think people make up gods. Need to nap. Okay, bye. Science is the search for truth, not truth itself. Or I'd say, science is also I think the word truth can mean, like the word reality can mean a lot of things. The word truth can mean a lot of things. Accurate, it can mean real, so I think I'm going to stay away from that one, but I think I get what you got, where you're getting at. All right. Let's see. Scientism is the promotion of science as the best or only objective means by which society should determine normative and epistemological values. Thanks, Wiki. Yeah. And there's also a phenomenon called naive realism. This idea that human beings have the capacity of objectively processing information and objectively interpreting it and objectively presenting it. And then if everyone was just given the same information, they'd all come to the same conclusions. And that's the kind of arrogance that I see, unfortunately, at work a lot with people in the natural sciences. And I'm going to tell you why. Because people in the sciences, are often taught, they're taught how to do science, but they're not taught how. They're taught the mechanics of it. but they're not taught the philosophy of it. They're given the standards by which things are accepted, but they don't really spend any time investigating or questioning why that is. And that's just the way it is, and we produce truth, and life is just way more complicated. All right, I'm going to reduce this down because we definitely don't need this in HD. Even that HD is pretty. All right, so let's finally, after all of this talk, I guess I have to put my headphones on. All right, I'm going to go, I've got notes. Are these my notes? These are my notes. We're just going to skip the first third of this video. And I'm going to unpack it and explain more specifically why it's wrong. And so how can I, let's see. The things that I found wrong with this video are as follows. It relies primarily on different types of logical fallacies. So there is a lot of poisoning the well here. He, instead of, presenting a charitable even or robust version of the social construction perspective or what a social construct is, King Crocoduck pretty much just immediately dismisses everything that is coming out of this perspective of social constructionism as coffeehouse woke people, which dismisses their degrees and dismisses their body of work and their academic credentials, and so it's meant to poison the well. He repeatedly strawmans social constructionism and social constructionists like myself in this video. And then there's also the logical fallacy of guilt by association. He equates creationists to social constructionists, which is the most ridiculous thing ever. And so but the main problem with this video is that he never actually demonstrates that science is not a social construct. And, if you want to say, oh, the science isn't a social construct, it instead is, blah, he doesn't make that argument either. So what happens in this video is that King Crocoduck spends like the first third of it just kind of like throwing a bunch of scientific terms at you. But if we think about the categories I gave, it's not an ontological argument. It's of what exists. It's not even an epistemological argument as to how do we develop knowledge, how do we produce knowledge, how do we know what exists, and how do we know what we know is right. He goes right to methods, and you're like, oh, here is a theory and here is a hypothesis, which he gets wrong, and he's describing the process of science, but none of that is a refutation that all of those things are social constructs. So we're gonna skip over a lot of that, but I will let him. So I'm going to mute this. I guess I'll show you the first few seconds and kind of give you a sense of his contemptuous tone. It's way overdeveloped sense of mansplaining. Here, like, oh, look at these silly people with PhDs. I, as he's like an undergraduate, maybe a master's in one field who's never published anything. Let me tell you what the world is. All right, I think. Oh no, I've got to put this off of mute. All right, here we go. Oh, dang it. Hold on. Sorry. I did that thing again. I was watching a thing last night. Stop. And I switched where the sound was coming out. So you guys can hear it, but I can't. So let me just quickly. I was so focused on getting my lighting right, I forgot to set up my audio. All right. I think I've got it. Now for the third time. Yeah, so by the way, Mark, so I love when Christy breaks it down to basics. I'm working on a video series I'll be recording, which is debunking sexist takes. I really feel like now that Trump is on his way out, I have an ability to go back to do the things that I feel like there needs to be more content that I can speak to, besides anti-fascism on YouTube. And the first one I'm going to do is Jordan Peterson and Camilla, or no, Paglia, whatever, I forget her first name. But oh my god, they're just on misunderstanding of patriarchy. So much misinformation out there, and this is how I feel I can contribute. Alright, so speaking of misinformation, let's go. There we go. Third time for you guys.
Recently, this photo of an anthropology lecture with a presentation titled Scientific Facts or Social Constructs was posted to Twitter, where it received a reply from none other than Neil deGrasse Tyson himself. The professor's smartphone is based on 1,000 facts of science. The only social construct is the social media enabled by it.
Oh, how embarrassing. Seriously. Like, Neil deGrasse Tyson is good at some parts of science, but oh man, this is embarrassing. He doesn't, first of all, he doesn't understand what a social construct is. And facts of science, again, are produced by human beings and are open to being changed in the future. So a scientific fact isn't like, again, this sort of like thing that exists outside of human beings. In fact, facts can't exist without human beings. Neil, are you hearing me? Hello? You gotta like understand how knowledge is produced. Stop crapping on the way that we produce knowledge. It's meant, the scientific mind should be humble enough to know that it doesn't know everything. And so this overestimated arrogance, this misplaced confidence in the certainty of something, just because, you're working with a material reality that has consistent results. I mean, how many planets are there in the solar system? Like, that material reality always had consistent results, but science, y'all changed your minds, and we just went along with it. So, facts. Yeah, 1,000 facts that can be changed. And so there's a little bit of an appeal to authority here. I have listened to Neil deGrasse Tyson say he doesn't care for the philosophy of science. That's like saying I like cars, but I don't understand how they work. I mean, you can, but then shut the heck up about the philosophy of science. If you don't understand it, you're not interested, then don't be talking out of school about social constructionism. That's fine. Not everyone wants to do debates about ontology and epistemology, but then you disqualify yourself from being able to say anything with authority, which is another social construct, on the subject. Just what was Wittgenstein said on that which we cannot understand, we have to remain silent? And try that, Neil. All right. So then, okay.
This tweet ignited an enormous argument between scientifically literate people and woke Starbucks hipsters.
There's a first poisoning of the well, and also straw manning, because the idea that anyone who disagrees is a woke Starbucks hipster as opposed to an academic who publishes in the field is again poisoning the well.
Spreading beyond Twitter and onto other social media. The character of this exchange is very recognizable to those who are acquainted with the science wars.
Now this, haven't read the science wars, but I'm immediately, I have to say, I'll make this full screen so y'all can see. But the questions here are just the way that they're posed set off red flags in my head. Are facts discovered or invented? They're constructed. I mean, the idea that, so I guess this kind of like shows the misunderstanding of the nature of existence that exists within the natural sciences too much. Not everyone, I want to say. But the idea that, again, humans are just discovering facts. We play no role in the determination of what a fact is, or the revision of facts, or the criteria of knowledge. We just, boom, oh look, I discovered a fact. I had my language construction, my value system, nothing. I just discovered it. Boom. And pitting that against invented. Now, invented to me means like it didn't exist and now it does. Neither of those is construction. Construction is a process of looking at things, debating it, having a standard, having other people agree, and then a community adopting a view. It's socially constructed. So even this binary to me is just comes from the wrong perspective ontologically. Is science objective or biased? Again, this is a false framing. Science can have, let's say, a framework for treating all data and all approaches in the same way, but the people doing the science can be biased. If you come from an anti-capitalist point of view and you're doing, like an anti-communist point of view, and you're doing economic studies, and you only pick out variables that sort of like deal with capitalism, that don't look at all the critiques of capitalism, that don't take into account any variables that you find from Marxist critical analysis, you're not being objective. You might use an objective method like time series analysis, but the method objectivity doesn't give you objectivity. It's like saying, is a car, it's like a drunk person operating a car or a sober person operating a car. The mechanics of the car are the same. It's the condition of the person driving it that ends up making it dangerous or safe, right? So this whole science war thing seems like a load of crap to me. Now, I haven't read it, but again, just the framing of it, I'm already quite suspicious that the people debating scientific knowledge and technology don't actually understand social constructionism.
An academic dispute over the same issue, and whose history I'm documenting in an ongoing series on this channel.
Oh, by the way, King Crocoduck hasn't done a video for like a year. I don't know what happened to them. But it's still worth, like I said, this video is still wrong. So, and wrong videos are always timeless when it comes to refutation. So.
In this video, I'm going to address the claim that scientific facts are social constructs.
Now, remember this. Remember this timestamp, 44 seconds. I'm going to address the fact that scientific facts are social constructs. They don't. They don't. They don't. Race and science are both social constructs developed through colonization. That is an accurate statement. And you want to look at like the fact that whiteness as a concept is a direct result of the power relations in the United States, that whiteness didn't exist as a concept in the way it currently does in Europe, that it is a consequence of that. And colonization, the slave trade, all of that. So, I mean, I don't know what okay, I'm going to be honest here. I have a better basis for talking about the race being a social construct developed through colonization than science. And so I'm going to put a pin in that one. But another thing that King Crocoduck does a lot that is a form of well poisoning is to constantly put up images without context and then characterize the motives of the people doing the thing or the attitudes of the people doing the thing. It's basically just kind of like a very lazy logical fallacy, kind of poisoning the well way of, oh, look how ridiculous they are, we can just dismiss them, rather than taking up the points and trying to address them. All right, so I'm going to kind of skip some of this, because when we get to 59 seconds in, he's going to start doing a whole bunch of definitions.
Unpacking the various meanings associated with this proposition, and explaining why I recommend listeners to be on their guard whenever they hear somebody propose this. But before I do that, I'm going to need definitions.
All right, so at this point in the video, and I'm not even kidding about that, he spends the next 13 minutes, people, 13 minutes, just throwing out various definitions about science. And look at science, here's the theory, here's, oh, well, yeah, hypothesis, we have to get to that. And it really has nothing to do with social constructionism whatsoever. If you want to say science is a social construct, you don't start with science. Or you want to refute the idea that science is a social construct, you don't start with science. Because you want to start with a thing that you want to refute, right? Like, what is a social construct? What isn't a social construct? How do we know the difference between social constructs and non-social constructs? If science isn't a social construct, then what is it? And that question doesn't get answered here. And I remember. That being said, like it's a 37-minute video. There's a lot of crap spoken with. So I'm going to go ahead, just to show it, to prove, talks about theory incorrectly. All right, let's talk about his definition of theory.
Organisms pass on their genes to their offspring is a scientific fact.
Oh yeah, he tries to like rarefy facts. Oh, these things are facts, they're true in the world. Like, yeah, but they're socially produced. Like they're social constructs in terms of they're constructed by people. Ignores that part.
A scientific theory is a network of facts that collectively produce novel, testable, and falsifiable predictions.
No. You can have a theory that doesn't produce a falsifiable prediction. Now, it's not testable, but it could be an attempt to account for them. Again, I think that my definition is far superior because it mostly focuses on the idea that the concepts inside your theory have to be a logical proposition of how causality works in the world. And it's not about individual facts. The theory of evolution it talks about the impact of time and environment on a species. There are no facts in there. I mean, time exists, environments exist, genes exist, but I don't see any facts in there. So I think that's a terrible definition. And I don't think that there's any, what's the word I'm looking for? Citations given for this. There's a whole lot of stuff about trying to use evolutionary theory to, justify how science isn't socially constructed without defining social construction. And this, sorry, I needed to get to this. This is terrible. This is, I don't know where they got this. I don't know whose slide this is. But this, oh, you can't see it now because I'm too big. All right, go back. This is crap. This is rubbish. All right, I think I'm going to go theater mode. Yes. Hypothesis. Is it an educated guess? No, it's not. A hypothesis is a very specific thing in quantitative analysis, right? If you want to look at data and try to use falsification, it's not an educated guess. A hypothesis, or an hypothesis, is a statement derived from a theory. That is observable, falsifiable, and can be tested against the data. Hypotheses, not tested or not tested much. Hypotheses are retested all the time. The theory of evolution is tested every time another person does a study on the evolution, an evolutionary conclusion about genes or the expression of genes. What's that called? Not phenomenology. It starts with a PH. Oh, phenotypes. Right? This is crap. This is such a bad slide. Nothing on this slide is true. Hypothesis is not an educated guess. A hypothesis is a falsifiable statement derived from a theory that is designed to test that theory. And hypotheses are tested all the time. Rational choice theory in politics is tested all the time. Sociological theories are tested all the time. The theory of evolution is tested. The theory of gravity is tested all the time. Every time a theory withstands falsification is another test of that theory. Or if it doesn't, so this is just wrong. It's just wrong. Scientifically, this is wrong. A theory is not a well-accepted answer. A theory is a causal explanation of what we observe and a link between those two things. It's well tested. There are a lot of theories, like in theoretical mathematics. You can have theories that aren't well tested because you're not capable of testing them. Right? And it's supported by many experiments. Again, a theory is, you can have a theory and it not be supported. You can still have a theory. So you're talking about the difference between, like well-accepted theories. But a theory, like before Charles Darwin could test out his theory of evolution, it was still a theory. So I am now confused about the actual definition of a hypothesis. All right. I'm going to go back. All right, so hypothesis. All right, so let me give you an example. Let's say that my theory is that as the body physically ages, individuals become more concerned with the quality and accessibility of healthcare. Right? The relationship there is that you're assuming that people have a self-interest and that because they're getting more physical ailments, they are becoming more invested or interested in the health outcomes. So that's your theory. So how would I test that? Well, I could go in to a data set and say, if my theory is correct, right, how can I form a testable statement based on that theory? So the key thing about a hypothesis in the quantitative sciences, right, and that I think you can only do hypothesis testing in the quantitative sciences, is it has to be capable of being shown to be wrong. So what would the world look like if my theory was wrong? Well, young people would express interest in the NHS, let's say in Britain, or in healthcare in the US, at very similar rates to old people, that age would not be something that people would differentiate their attitudes. So I can go into a survey and I can organize respondents who've answered questions about how much, the most important issue in an election. What's your most important issue? And what percentage of those people in an open-ended question gave the answer healthcare, health insurance, the NHS in the US, in the UK. And then I can organize them into cohorts, for instance, and I can see whether or not, if I put it into a model with other socio-demographic concern, things like their educational background, their income, where they live in the country, their gender identity, whatever else, because there might be other explanations out there, right? And I run my little model, and I find out that the coefficient for age is positively associated with concern, or the likelihood of saying the health issues are your most important political concern. In this case, my theory that age is a driver of people's likelihood of being concerned about health issues has not been refuted by the data. Let's say I find that the older you get, for every 5 years older you get, or let's say if you've gotten cohorts, for every cohort that you move up, you're 10% more likely to list healthcare as a major concern. Right? Now, is that the only reason people are doing it? No. But there could be other contributing causes. But what I can say here is that age is a statistically significant explainer of this outcome, that I can find beyond random chance that older people are just more likely than younger people to cite these things. So in this case, I have a theory about a causal relationship. I have a statement that predicts what the world should look like if my theory was right, and what the world would look like if my theory were wrong. And then I go to the data and I look to see, based on analysis and the accepted conventions of what is considered causality for my discipline, which is a social construct, was my theory capable of did it match the real world results? And so don't feel bad, or so many times when I'm doing peer review, I find that my colleagues don't correctly formulate their hypotheses and their alternative hypotheses. I'm not saying the social sciences are purely brilliant when it comes to the philosophy of social science. A lot of times I have pulled people up in my peer reviews that your hypothesis isn't falsifiable, or your hypothesis here isn't actually an hypothesis. Or based on the way you worded it, I don't think you can draw conclusions from your results. And they've got the right idea, but they've got the formation of it wrong. They've got the wording wrong. Because there's always the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis. And so if there isn't a clear way of saying what the null hypothesis is, what the world would look like if my hypothesis or my theory were wrong, then you can't reject the null hypothesis based on the data and be forced to accept the alternative. Right? So in the case of the aging and the healthcare, if there was no statistically significant difference between the cohorts in the rate at which they said they were concerned about healthcare as their top priority, well, then my theory isn't, I can't reject the null hypothesis that age is irrelevant. And so I'd have to accept the null hypothesis. In order for me to deduce or reach the conclusion that my theory was correct, or was able to explain the world accurately, I would need there to be a statistically significant difference between the youngest cohort and the oldest cohort, or the first two cohorts and the upper two cohorts, or an increasing statistical significant, whatever. However, I was measuring those things in my model. And if there was a difference, then my null hypothesis is there should be no difference. Well, I can see a difference, so I have to reject the null hypothesis of no difference. And the null hypothesis generally is usually no effect or no difference. At least in the social sciences. I don't know how it works in the natural sciences always. And because I see a difference, I have to conclude an alternative hypothesis. So I hope that it helps. But this is not a hypothesis. It's not an educated guess. It is independent of how much testing or lack of testing it's had. These are just completely wrong. And I wanted to point that out. This is a core fundamental error that just needed to be called out on. So the hypotheses are the possible outcomes of testing a theory. I think that's close. I think that the way that I would say that is, a hypothesis is a way of predicting a specific outcome based on the logic of that theory. The thing about a hypothesis, again, is that it has to be falsifiable. So it has to kind of have within it, here's what the world would look like if my theory was correct, and it kind of has to imply what the world would look like, the conditions for if it were wrong. Another example is the Babington, I think it was called, experiment. Now, there's a little bit of like questions about the effects of the atmosphere, but Albert Einstein, this is mentioned by Popper, by the way, in his book on like science is falsification, or there's a chapter on it. But Einstein had this theory of gravity, and according to his theory of gravity, it was so powerful that even light would bend. Even light would be caught up in the force of gravity and affected by it. That was a pretty bold statement at the time. And the way that he went about looking to see whether, the way that it was tested was that there was an expedition, I think it was the Babington expedition, I might get the name wrong, to the Arctic or the Antarctic, I can't remember which one it was now, and they wanted to take a picture of a planet before and during an eclipse of the sun. And there was a solar eclipse happening. So they went up and they had their camera equipment in the 1920s or whatever it was. And they set it up. So before the solar eclipse, they took a picture of the location of this one planet in the sky. And then the next day, they took a picture of the same planet during a solar eclipse. Now, according to Einstein's predictions, because of the sun and its mass, the light from that star, as it passed through behind the solar eclipse, should be pulled over. The star should look like it moved. And of course, the explanation here is not that the star moved, but that the light photons were shifted by the gravity of the sun. And so it looked like the planet moved because of the force of gravity. And now, they didn't know so much about like atmospheric distortions or whatever, but he was still right. What they found was when they took a picture, when the solar eclipse was happening, is that the planet looked like it had shifted. And so they were able, now the important thing about that was he had a prediction about what the world would look like based on his idea of causality, the effect of gravity on light. And had it been the case that during that solar eclipse, the position of the planet didn't change at all, it was identical, well, that would be a refutation of the theory. So a hypothesis, yes, it's a testable question. Yeah, and the theory is an explanation of the causality of what's happening. A theory is like a framework for usually causality. How do things, that kind of thing. It's a more generic. So the theory of evolution talks about the effects of time and the natural environment and pressures on a species. But the way that we test the theory of evolution comes down to observation. So, can I define both theory and hypothesis? I did this before, but I will do it again just to be helpful. Sometimes I know people see things and it's easier for them to process it when they can see the words. So I have all kinds of stuff here. Quantitative, qualitative divide, methods, methodology, going back, Bertrand Russell. All right. So, in the this is my preferred definition. In the sciences, including the social sciences, a theory is a logical explanation of the manner of interactions of a set of phenomenon. A logical explanation means that we can use them like logical processes to connect things. It's not superstition. It's not saying God did it. Okay? And it also has to have these characteristics, right? Or should have these characteristics, I think, to be a good scientific theory. It has to have like a model of the world that you can test against observation. It should be able to not only describe events or observations now, but it should predict how things function in the future. And that's because if you're talking, a theory is a series of a manner of interactions between a set of phenomenon, it's ongoing. So let's go back to the more nebulous one of age and concern about health provision. That's not going to change over the course of time. Like, if that's an actual thing that happens to people, that's sort of like, exogenous in that way, it's going to be found across time, across societies. And you should be able to kind of like make future predictions about this. And then it should be capable of being tested. So a theory is the idea of how things work. The hypothesis is the statement that you use to make a prediction that you test against the data. Does that make sense? So you don't, I mean, it is theory testing, but you're testing a theory with a specific set of data and a specific set of wording that says, I think the outcome should look like this. I expect the coefficients of this model to be positive and statistically significant. That is how you test a hypothesis. So, I hope that helps. Okay. All right, so there's a whole lot of fluff. I'll tell you the concepts that he goes through and defines for freaking almost 13 and a half minutes. Fact, theory, model, background propositions, falsification, undetermination, factors in theory choice, paradigm shift, and I think we're finally, so all of this, none of this is refuting the idea that science is socially constructed. None of it. I don't quite understand what the point of this is. And, by the time you're 8 minutes in, you've kind of forgotten what the whole point of the theory is. Or, sorry, the whole point of the whole video is. So, I mean, if this was an essay, I'd say, what does this have to do with your main question? What does this have to, nothing. You're just kind of throwing things. You're trying to blind people with science. Look at how awesome science is without actually dealing with the fact that it's, without actually dealing with the fact that it's a social construct. So he goes on and on, and he's only dealing with one element of science, not looking at all the social sciences, because, natural science bias, which is also, something he doesn't recognize. All kinds, oh my gosh, look at all of this. 12 minutes in! 12 minutes in! And we're still not to the point. Okay, so we're finally getting there. Poe Mama says, it does make sense. My brain is working hard to change my previous misunderstandings. Okay. Right. So then we get to 1325. We're starting to get there. Science is a social construct. And at 1338, he says something about science wouldn't exist without a society as a truism. And that's about the closest he gets to admitting science is a social construct. So, and obviously, and I want to just point out, the Lucky Wanderer is making an excellent point. It doesn't help that people use the term theory to mean conjecture in just everyday language. Or I have an hypothesis, and they don't really make it falsifiable, and they have no data to test it against, and they're not looking at, even basic, like a t-test for small sample data sets, or anything like that to show relationships between people. So, yeah, there's a way we use this language within academia, and then there's a way people use it in the public sphere, which are slightly different.
Various properties have just been laid out. Because the scientific activity tests models rather than individual facts, the statement that motivated this entire controversy is somewhat malformed.
Again, malformed. I think he got that from Thunderfoot. But the thing is, it fails to acknowledge that humans produce facts based on what they know at the time, and a fact is an accurate statement of what we know at the time. But that could change, and so facts can change, and you can't say that a fact is truth if it changes, because truth doesn't change, and yet facts do, like the number of planets in the solar system. Yeah, and here's the thing, too. Yeah, he talks about, so Lucky Wanderer says, I just noticed he used the concepts of scientific paradigms described by Kuhn. Absolutely true. Which is funny because Kuhn was catching on to the social construction of science. Absolutely. The idea that there's a paradigm shift in science shows that it's not merely just reflecting a mirror of objective reflection, that humans are just describing what they see. So Kuhn talked about paradigm shifts in science, how you have an initial idea. The most classic example of this is to look at, the atomic view of the world. Before quantum mechanics, there was a sort of the atomistic notion of determinism. We thought we understood how the universe operated on the atomic level, and that was it. And so everything was framed in terms of that perspective. And then with technology and instruments, scientists were able to uncover the quantum level. And the thing about the quantum level is it did not behave according to the rules of the deterministic sort of atomic view of the world. Now, again, I don't do physics, so cut me some slack, but you know what I mean here. Einstein's view of the world is how everything operates. There was a different mode of existence underlying the observed existence that we could see and observe with the instruments available at the time. And at first, Einstein didn't like the idea of the theory of quantum physics. He was the one, God does not play with dice or whatever it was. But the evidence became overwhelming. The evidence for the existence of a quantum level mode of existence and how it behaved was just, it kept accumulating and accumulating and accumulating until eventually the old worldview had to be thrown out. And there had to be a new view of what could exist and how it could exist. And that became the new truth, right? And what does that prove? It proves that knowledge is socially constructed. Yes, science is self-correcting. That's a good thing. I'm fine with that. Science catches its own errors and it should, if it's true to its principles of wanting to produce accurate knowledge, go with the information that most accurately represents the world. But all of these are things that humans construct between them. So yes, Kuhn is actually showing that knowledge is socially constructed and that scientific facts, are social constructs based on what people understand and know at the time. So yeah, play at dice, play with dice. Yeah, cool. Einstein, yeah.
But that is a minor quibble. Now that we're armed with a better understanding of what science is and how it operates...
By the way, you're not going to know better what science is or how it operates based on that discussion, as I've already pointed out.
We may examine what is meant by propositions to the effect of science is a social construct and what they imply.
Buckle up, people.
If one were merely to say that scientific models are social constructs because they wouldn't exist absent a society, one would be stating a truism.
That's literally, I think, the best attempt he makes, which is a hand-waving attempt at saying, yeah, actually everything happens within a society and is constructed by individuals in that society, mediated through the values of that society, and so yes, science is actually a social construct.
A model, by definition, is a description of reality, and descriptions require social actors.
Not only social actors, they require language, which is socially constructed, and also standards by which valid knowledge is accepted, or by which criteria constitutes valid knowledge, which is also subjective and socially constructed. So literally every point in the process of doing science is a result of what people decided, constructed, and agreed upon.
This is utterly uncontroversial.
And yet you're saying it's not a social construct. Like, you can't have it both ways. And that's what he's trying to do here. He's trying to say both, yes, everything is produced by society and by social actors, and implicitly through actions, through actors who have values and beliefs and opinions and all these other sort of things that go into deciding what is science, but yet it's not a social construct? Well, then what is it?
It does not exhaust the meaning of such statements as scientific facts are social constructs, even though some social constructionists will make it seem as though this were all that were being implied.
Oh, another thing that happens a lot is that he doesn't really quote individuals. There's a lot of attribution as to what social constructionists think without quoting people saying those things. I think later, at some point, he maybe quotes Derrida, but Derrida was a philosopher. He was never a social scientist. So I don't even understand. Well, of course, it's It's smoke and mirrors. It's meant to put someone up in order to be mocked, not as an actual representation of what is being said or what was being conveyed.
To say that science is a social construct is to say that the conclusions reached by a scientific model are not just shaped by facts, but are also shaped by values that are particular to the social situation of whoever is doing the research.
Like, who said that? Here's the thing about science. It is value-laden. There's all kinds of values in science. For instance, what is the cutoff for what is considered statistically significant? That is a value judgment. It's not an objective, there's something magical about 0.05 or 0.01 or 0.001 when it comes to statistical significance, p-values. Those are just conventions that people made up, and we can change them. I've seen people who present results that take 0.10, 10 and 100. Now, I personally would disagree with that, and we have a difference of values. Which coefficients should be considered statistically significant and interpreted as having a causal impact? There isn't a truth factor where we can go to. That's the thing that people talk about together. So again, science has all kinds of values built into it, and things like scientific racism. Scientific sexism, like essentialism, all of these things are people smuggle in their values. Even the idea of having a binary of biology. I remember Sargon of Akkad tried to argue that it must be the case that there are only two sexes because Charles Darwin, again, appeal to authority, only wrote about males and females, even though he mentions for eunuchs in there. Well, I was like, Charles Darwin assumed there were only two sexes. And then he framed his entire discussion in terms of that assumption. And then you're saying his conclusion is somehow fact? No, he assumed the thing that you want to conclude. He didn't prove it. He just framed his entire, you could in theory, have multiple categories for sex based on, if you want to talk about expressions, or if you want to talk about genetics, or you want to talk about, a lot of cultures have third genders. Not in Western society, but in other societies. And so the idea that, this whole thing that people smuggle in their values and their sexism, all kinds of stuff into their science. And science won't catch that. Science is just it's like a process. It's like I want to say a food processor, but it's like a little machine, right? And if you put in garbage assumptions and you put in garbage data, the way that science treats all things objectively the same doesn't make your data any better. It doesn't make it objectively true. Your scientific racism isn't more valid because you put it through the hoops of science. It means that you're starting values. Beliefs and assumptions were garbage. So, a lot of classical science terms contain gendered language and illusions that influence the way they were studied. Absolutely, all of which led to a misunderstanding of science. The fact that most medical trials excluded women is a reflection of the bias of the scientists who are engaging in it. And I think if there were more women in the room and more diverse types of people in the room, you would get different outcomes that are better representative of the sample. Look at the Tuskegee experiments, right? That had value, that reflected the disregard of value for human life for some people. That was smuggled into science. So, no, all science is value-laden. And I know this bothers people because they want to reach for an objective truth, just like believers want to reach for God. But it's an illusion. It's the best we can do. Just tone it down a little. But if I play with my p-value, doesn't it affect my beta? No, statistical significance is different from the size of the coefficient. So in a regression model, you get size, sign, significance, and strength. The strength is the strength of the model, so we'll put that one up. The size of the coefficient, or the beta, tells you what variable in the model is having the biggest explanatory contribution, or biggest effect, is how we interpret it. The sign tells you whether it increases or decreases the thing, and then the significance tells you whether or not it has an effect that we can conclude despite I lost my train of thought. We can conclude outside of the chance of randomness, like a 1 in 5 chance that my sample is biased, or not biased, but isn't representative of the population. So no, your beta is different from the significance, or the size of your coefficient's contribution is different from the significance of it. I hope that helped. When you look at the picture, you rarely see the frame. That's, Sean, yes. Yeah, absolutely. That's a really, really good insight. Yeah, I think that says a lot. Okay.
Arguments for why this is the case will vary from coffee shop to coffee shop.
And again, this is his sort of poisoning the well way of dismissing all people who look at things from a social constructionist point of view, shows his contempt in that he's not seriously engaging with the arguments. I think mostly because he doesn't actually understand them.
But the feature common to all varieties of social constructionism is the belief that scientific conclusions are necessarily influenced by socially specific background values.
Said no one? Said no one? Necessarily. He's choosing his language here very deliberately, and it's just wrong. There is a case to be made that sometimes background values do make a contribution, but is it necessary to the understanding of what social constructionism, how it is a theory of knowledge production? No, absolutely not. So again, this is a misrepresentation or a misunderstanding. I could be charitable saying he just misunderstands it, but I actually think there's an agenda here to misrepresent it.
Scientific facts are not just theory-laden, but are also value-laden.
Yeah. Yeah. What is it? A fact itself represents a value. And I know that they want to get away from this, and this idea that science is purely objective and there's no subjective assessment. But there is always a subjective element of science because it's done by people. And it's constructed through agreement. And that agreement oftentimes has more to do with the standards of the community than any appeal to an outside force or thing that everyone can point to and go, this is our cutoff thing. Or, this is our determinant. It's usually a concept that determines whether or not a fact is considered accurate or whatever.
According to the social constructionists, whether it's because of differences in epistemic privilege by virtue of different social situations, differences in the psychologies of different groups due to differences in upbringing, or the unique historical and cultural contexts that shape every discourse, including science, every scientist will construct scientific knowledge in a manner that reflects their place in society.
Did I say that? Did anything we look at today say that? No. Is there a case that some science is done, can be critiqued from these points of view? Yeah, but it doesn't mean that it's a necessary part of social constructionism. And also, he puts in here, two, that little footnote as if he's citing someone. And I went down, let's have a look. Let's have a look at what note 2 says. What is the source for note 2? Note 2. There is no dispute over whether social values have some influence over which sciences are pursued and to what extent they are funded. Oh, you mean there are values that are influencing science, even though you've just tried to dismiss that. Okay. The dispute is over whether there exist values and or interests that are unique to particular demographics, which then play a role in theory selection and construction. Well, that's not really disputed. That's an historical fact. We know that because of values, for instance, men excluded women's subjects from various medical experiments and then treated everybody according to the results based purely on samples of men, even if that didn't fit. The perfect example of that is presentation for heart attack. We know that some women present having a heart attack with different complaints than men do. And if you don't analyze that, then you don't catch it, and then women die because you didn't want the inconvenience of having to control for hormone fluctuation. Well, then you're choosing you're choosing one group over the other and making it more likely that they're going to survive because you're customizing your treatments to that group. Also, this dispute over whether he again doesn't say who who's having these disputes. I never mentioned this idea the whole time I've talked about social constructionism. So straw man. That scientific theories are constructed is not what is presently under dispute, but but the whole point of your video is that science is not a social Can we just compare this? Because we're almost done. I mean, there's no point really in going through this whole very, very painful video. Is science a social construct? He says it's not. And yet, here in note 2, buried in the middle of the paragraph, that scientific theories are constructed is not what is presently under dispute. But it is. That's exactly what's under dispute. That's what your video is about. The question is whether they are constructed from facts in order to maximize their predictive power, or whether they are socially constructed from both facts and socially specific values for the purpose of legitimizing the social perspectives associated with those values. You know, you should have made a video about that, because that is a complete misrepresentation of both the debate, the fundamental ontology and epistemological issues, and also the entire framing of this. So again, this is terrible. This video is such propaganda. Yes, science is a social construct, and there are times in the practice of science when human values get smuggled in and people don't recognize their own biases. And those biases, like scientific racism, is a classic example of how racist normative view that white people are the best are used to then frame all other results. And whatever the white people do is supposed to be like, oh, that's the optimal. It might be the top, or it might be like the, oh, you know, when it comes to IQ, Asian people are here, but IQ is a social construct. So yeah, you can go ahead and watch this video, but honestly, it's getting a bit long now. I'm gone over 2 hours. I want to kind of keep this short, but basically the whole stuff, well, okay, we'll put it on super fast and we'll let him run for a little while just to, in fairness. But that whole point, he's just conceded the argument. In note 2, he concedes that science is a social construct, and yet he goes on for another like 20 minutes misrepresenting social constructionism and social constructionist perspectives on the production of knowledge.
A privileged member of society will incorporate one set of background values into their models in order to maintain the status quo. An oppressed member of society will incorporate another set of background values into their models in order to bring about emancipatory change.
Again, no citations or quotes as to who is saying this.
Neither model has any objective advantage over the other because both are ultimately the subjective expressions of whoever develops them. A scientific model is taken to be informed by the values that are held by the scientists who develop it.
Well, yes and no. I mean, yeah, the theories, there's a whole lot of value assumptions. But of course, the lie that King Crocoduck here is trying to push in this video is that somehow social constructionists are trying to like use values in some way to advance multiple scientific practices. That's just a lie. There aren't multiple sciences. You can look at things at like multiple variables and models, but a big failing on this is he doesn't actually cite anyone claiming to want these things. He tends to rely on using what he thinks are extreme, you know, like the feminist critique of glaciers or whatever, which is about sustainability, really, without looking into it in any depth. It's just really weak.
Which in turn are determined by which demographics those scientists belong to.
And no one says that your science is determined by your demographics. Did I say that anywhere? Did you see that in my lecture notes? Strawman. Just strawman. So this is another...
The existence of a
sorry. Oh, yeah.
Plurality of sciences. Each particular...
The existence of a plurality of sciences? Who said that? Nobody. Again, nobody. This one talks about... So here's a classic example of the way that he misrepresents things. He'll put up this graphic with a highlight: Western science, the science taught in most schools, is neither personally meaningful nor useful to their everyday lives. What is this talking about? Now, he's trying to present this as this is an attack on science. But it's about educating like kids and making a scientific perspective connected to their lives. So it says, some students enjoy understanding their world in a way similar to their science teachers. They share a scientific worldview. They enjoy the challenge of the mindset of learning the standards of the discipline. They want to think and talk and believe based on a value system the way academic scientists do. However, not all students possess a scientific mindset. Look, I work in qualitative data analysis. I still do rigorous analysis even though I can't do hypothesis testing. And while my claims are more circumscribed, they are grounded in data and repeated observation and observations. So in this case, the majority of students prefer to understand nature through other worldviews, like beauty, aesthetics, religion, or economics, utilitarian, spiritual, recreational, or a mix of orientations. These science-shy students are less enthusiastic about thinking and talking and believing scientifically. And they say Western science is oftentimes not presented in a way that's personally meaningful or useful to their everyday lives. Why? Because science tries to talk about things in very general, abstract terms. So the point here is that we need to talk about science in different modes of communication in order to get kids engaged. Not that we need multiple sciences. Now you can go through like frame by frame, and there's so much more misinformation that is presented through this sort of logical fallacy of straw manning, of presenting people's arguments but not actually accurately presenting their arguments.
To the demographic that partakes in the scientific activity, because the science that has been given institutional legitimacy was historically...
Have you ever seen like a course for straight white male science? No. But what you have seen are critiques of the fact that because science was limited through power, political power, economic power, resources access, to a small group, that a lot of the science reflected the values and the worldviews. Like Darwin assuming only two sexes, despite the fact that he had observed things that went outside of that, and forcing everything into those two categories. That's a value. That's not science in terms of being objective. It's a subjective imposition on observations that are otherwise, could be objective.
Developed by straight white men, the values that have shaped scientific conclusions have reflected that, producing a science which has legitimated practices that benefit straight white men at the expense of everybody else.
Well, yeah. It has been. It has been, because who got the power to decide those things? It operated within their worldview. And to deny this is to deny the Tuskegee experiments and scientific racism and sexism in medical trials. And yet all those things are observable facts. So,
therefore, allowing for a plurality of culturally specific sciences will permit...
Who's asking for a plurality of culturally specific sciences? There are no culturally specific sciences in that some people are saying we need different processes. What they are talking about is perspectives that you bring to science and are represented in your observations.
Not only an expansion of scientific knowledge, but the legitimation of truths which serve the group interests of other demographics. Science, according to social constructionists, is ultimately politics by other means.
I mean, that is true. I mean, science is a way of determining what is true. And politics is, well, it depends on your definition of politics. But it says here, science is politics by other means and generates reliable information about the empirical world. Science is more than politics, of course, but it is that. It is a contested terrain and has been so from its origins. Yeah, people have argued about this stuff. Again, this denialism.
This view of the scientific enterprise stands or falls on whether socially specific background values do indeed have a non-negligible impact on scientific models.
No. When we talk about background values, are human beings capable of bias, and do those biases carry through into their theories of how things work and possibly their interpretation of the data? And what King Crocoduck wants to do is to basically straw man, again, create a false argument. He's not quoting anyone here when he's making these assertions, but saying somehow people like me, I want like a feminist science, and that feminist science is not just being aware of the way that patriarchy and misogyny have framed assumptions about men and women and the values and the norms that have been snuck into claims that are otherwise presented as objective. We're doing a critical analysis of science and its process itself, and for some reason, people find that threatening, but they really shouldn't. It's a way of making sure we're keeping science honest.
And so the entire field of science and technology studies, or STS, is dedicated to the exposure of how socially situated bias has influenced the development of scientific theories.
So again, like I said, he puts up these images and highlights things like, while we can use these models to expose masculine and other forms of bias, we can also use them to defend the introduction of assumptions grounded in feminist political values, which is egalitarianism. But this is supposed to make you want to hate feminists, right? So again, I find this to be a logical fallacy in many ways, or at least propaganda.
STS theorists will tirelessly publish strategies for creating a new science that takes a plurality of socially situated...
New science? No. Who's producing a new science? Feminist science is about a critique of science and the process. There's no, like, new alternative to, induction, deduction, theory generation, hypothesis testing. It's a misunderstanding of what the critique is.
Biases into account, all the while trying to imbue science with a set of background values that will orient the models in a manner deemed desirable by such theorists.
Again, who's he quoting? Nobody. Again, like here, science that earned its epistemic authority through its co-constitution with colonization and slavery. So, again, you can watch in this paper, I argue that those of us who have left the sciences proper and moved to feminist study spaces continue to do science through our teaching. When the impulse to do real science is palpable, I suggest we critically examine the political stakes of our affective attachments and detachments from sciences. This is supposed to be presenting feminist critique as somehow an alternative, but it's not. It's meant to be a critique of the process of the human biases that go into it again. So, science is a social construct. You can watch this whole video. It's really boring and painful. It uses a series of logical fallacies. And you're sort of like, you didn't watch the whole thing. Honestly, I was more interested in re-educating people who think science isn't a social construct. Now, if you take what I've shown you and the definitions and the sources like Bryman, Burr, Ways of Knowing, I forget the two authors there, and plenty of other people who actually know what they're talking about, and you watch this, knowing that, you'll see that this is mostly smoke and mirrors. I mean, it's almost all smoke and mirrors. It's a misrepresentation of pretty much everything. And you can tell that because of the real lack of any quotes from real people making actual arguments. As I said, at some point, I think he quotes Derrida, but Derrida wasn't a social scientist. Derrida is a philosopher. Here we go. Is it Derrida? Yes. Derrida is, again, doesn't do social science, so it's misplaced critique. You're wrong, King Crocoduck. And I showed you why. All right. If you want, you can always go to my academia.edu page. I haven't updated this recently. I really should. I kind of forgot I had this. But here you can see all of the lecture notes that I've provided for the 20-week course. Here are my lecture notes, for instance, on my quants course. And just go through it to show, what are social constructionists? How do they do science? Well, here we've got the philosophy of social science, and then we have content analysis and introduction to data analysis, because counting words and their sentiments is something that we can do empirically in the social sciences. Cross-tabulation and non-parametric tests from which you can't just infer causality, but you can describe the world with a crosstab. Correlation, also a measure of association, but for scale variables. And you can't draw inferences from it, but you can describe the world. Then the construction of scales in social research, factor analysis, principal components analysis, but that's the first way of, it's my primary introduction into inferential statistics. Sampling criteria, what statistical significance is and what are the assumptions behind it and how do we estimate it. Introduction to OLS, then multivariate OLS, the problems that your model can cause by sort of like mirages or problems with the data, such as multicollinearity, heteroscedasticity, and other outliers, and their impact on your findings and why you need to be aware of them. Then an overview of logistic regression, which is a probability-based regression analysis. Research design. So how do you actually design research with proper, how do you discuss theories and how do you deduce testable statements, hypotheses? How do you identify what your null and alternative hypotheses are? And then how do you estimate what we can reject or accept based on your your data. Then I've got here the checklist for quantitative essays. This is like basically, y'all need to do this in your essays in order to get full marks. Preparing your data for your analysis. So at this point, they'd kind of like done stuff on data sets that were already cleaned up, but oftentimes when you get a data set, you need to like look at it and understand it before you could run proper analysis. So this is a sort of at the end, like when you're doing your data analysis for your essay, make sure you clean up your data. And then also how to present your data, charts, labeling, should you use a table or a figure, how to not present information in a cluttered way that makes it harder for people to understand. And then I had a second course that I taught, Philosophy of Social Science. Again, it's pretty much identical in these two courses, the Philosophy of Social Science. I just spend more time on the qualitative methods in the qualitative course because obviously those are going to be applicable. Then start with research design and ethics because whereas most social survey data you do with secondary data, so you take someone else's data and you yourself do analysis on it. It's very rare for people to get funded in the social sciences to get enough money to do their own study. And so ethics kind of comes in, usually it's a less of a concern for people who are using data produced by other people. Whereas in qualitative research, it's a lot of interview face-to-face, and so ethics and research design ended up at the front of the class. What a case study is, how to do comparative methods. This gets back to like John Stuart Mill and most similar, most different design, how to do qualitative research and how to hear what people are saying. In a survey, you have your instrument and you just have people responding, like a little experiment, you're like, here's a question, here are your responses, how do you respond? Whereas with qualitative research, you have to do more work trying to understand where people are getting at. And so, focus group research, ethnographic, analyzing text, analyzing talk. A date with your family is funny. This one was about the norms that are brought into people's assumptions of what's right and wrong. Reliability and validity. What is reliability and validity in qualitative research? It's much easier to talk about in quantitative research, but it's still a challenge. And then how to write up your results. So you can always have a go. Look at those. Are also licensed under, what's the word I'm looking for? They're licensed under Creative Commons attribution. So anyway, didn't Croc grow up a bit and quit doing anti-SJW crap like a year ago? I don't know if he grew up. I do know that he stopped making videos, but this video is still out there and it's still, like over a year ago, but the video is still wrong and it's gotten over 91,000 views. So I think it's important to kind of put that corrected information out there because this is just misinformation. So I think it's always worth it. And I don't know where they are now. I don't know what they're doing, but that video was wrong. And 2 years later, it's still wrong. So I thought it would be worth discussing. Okay. And the other thing too is like if he quit doing SJW crap, he could take these videos down to stop putting out this misinformation. So, but he hasn't. So I will. And I needed content for a Sunday. So this was it. All right, this went way longer. Super longer, but I hope you guys found it informative and educational, and I hope it gave you a better and more accurate understanding of not when it comes to social constructionism, it's an issue of epistemology, really. It's a little bit of ontology, what exists, but social constructionism is really better housed within the theories of knowledge part of the sciences, which is how do we know things? And how we know things as human beings is by communicating with other human beings. And as a consequence, we're not tapping into a truth beyond ourselves that is objectively true. We are an active participant in our experience of reality and our understanding of it through language, through norms, and also the way that we understand the world constructively, through construction. All right, I'm gonna go chill out a bit, and then I've got my D&D game tonight, which will be exciting. Actually, I haven't done super much prep because I don't know what my players are gonna do, so mostly I'm gonna kick it to them. I have a couple things that I think might happen. but who knows? And if you're interested in finding out, we're actually doing the Dragon Heist game over on my channel, D&D with Christy, and we start at 7 o'clock my time, which is like in about 4.5 hours from now. What time is it? Oh my gosh, yeah, that sounds about something like that. All right, peeps, I'll see you next Sunday, and I hope you guys have a great day. Stay happy, stay healthy, stay well, wherever it is, whenever it is you are. And until next Sunday, I've been Christy, and oh, my stomach, can you hear that? I hope not. My stomach is really rumbling. It's time for me to have some lunch. I've been Christy. You've been awesome. Thank you so much for your time and attention. And until the next time we see each other, be well. Mwah, mwah. Bye.